What's up guys, Multiplier here, and today, quick little video on a mixing tip or mixing tips, and it's all about reverb. So reverb is basically where you put an effect on a sound and then you end up putting it in like a real space. So when you're, say, in a cathedral or in a different room or whatever, whenever you hear a noise, that noise goes straight to your ears, but it also bounces into walls and other objects and then goes into your ears kind of like a second, third, fourth, like lots of different times. And then your brain can kind of work out from all those various echoes and delays kind of what environment you're in. And that's kind of what reverb is. So that's why if you look through the list of reverbs, typically you'll have kind of names of various rooms, so whether it's vocal hall, medium concert, gymnasium, church, cathedral, big room, small room, garage, or even some kind of unnatural spaces, stuff like, frozen build-up, outer space, parallel walls, stadium, stuff like that. So you don't have to necessarily use reverb just to simulate the real world. You can create kind of like a supernatural environments for your sound to go in. And now there are loads of ways to use reverb, from quite subtle ways just to kind of make the sound a bit more real, through to kind of more creative uses where the reverb is almost a feature of the track in itself. But fundamentally, my main tips for kind of improving the reverb in your tracks come down to two things. First of all, you need to decide fundamentally what sort of mix you're doing. If it's a mix predominantly for DJs to play in clubs and festivals and stuff like that, it's a different style of mixing to doing a mix for like general listening, where people have got headphones on or proper speakers and they're sitting in a proper environment to listen. Now you can have a bit of both, but my main bit of advice would be, if you're mixing it mainly for clubs, go easy on the reverb. Simply because, for a start, the room or the club itself or the stadium or whatever else it is probably has a whole bunch of reverb in itself. So if you play a simple sound through the speakers, the audience is going to hear reverb from the environment. So you don't need to like put reverb on in the first place, because it's going to have its own reverb. And then if you have too many reverbs on top of each other, you're not really going to hear it. So you really want to keep your sounds nice and kind of reasonably dry when it comes to reverb, if you're mixing for clubs, festivals, all that kind of stuff. And also you've got to bear in mind, reverb only really works well when you're pretty symmetrical with regards to the speakers. If you're just standing next to one speaker, then you're not going to get all that subtlety, and you're not going to hear the delays in the way they're supposed to be heard. So you're not going to have that kind of like imagined space in your head. So fundamentally, if you're making it for the club, go easy on the reverb, because it's just not going to translate to the listener in that environment. Whereas if you're just kind of producing for like normal listening or for kind of just in general, you can go pretty crazy with the reverb, because there are a lot of people with proper headphones who will hear the subtleties. And in a normal environment, even if you can't kind of consciously hear it, all that kind of subtle reverb stuff you put in will be kind of heard by the listener, whether they know it or not. So it's fine to kind of get creative and go kind of indulge yourself there, which is cool. And I'd say so that's kind of the main point, or I'd say the first point with regards to reverb. The second point would be, reverb is great, but if you put reverb on everything, or you start stacking up reverbs too much, it starts to not work. You end up, if you have too much reverb going on, you have too many reflections going everywhere, your brain can't process it all. It just becomes this big kind of chaotic sea, this kind of like mesh of sound, and then you end up not really hearing any reverb at all. So definitely don't go too crazy on the reverb. Or I think the main bit of advice that I do is only put reverb on a small number of elements of the track. If you put reverb on everything in the track, or you put multiple reverbs on kind of like most of the things in the tracks, then what your brain can't do is figure out, if say it hears a delay or it hears kind of an echo from something, if it's hearing too much at once, it can't figure out where that echo was originally from, because there's too much competing with it. So you end up with this just big kind of rumbly sea of reverb noise, which I guess sometimes you could use for creative effects, but most of the time it's not going to improve the mix. It's just going to muddy things up. So really choose a few key elements to put reverb on, and leave everything else dry. pretty much entirely dry. That way your brain can like clearly work out what sounds the echoes originated from, and therefore it can create a space for it. And yeah, that's kind of the main second point really. Choose a few elements, just put reverbs on those, even if it's subtle or kind of like quite obvious as a creative effect. Just choose those small number of elements to do it with, and just leave everything else. And the reason why you have to kind of bear that in mind when you're producing your track is, let's say you have a track with, I don't know, 36, 40 different like layers to it, which is fine. It's not a particularly large amount of layers, but it's plenty. What you will find is if you take like a pretty non-significant layer, let's just say a simple like a few hi-hats or something, it will always sound better with a little bit of reverb versus no reverb. However, if you're just listening to those hi-hats by themselves. However, if you do that with every single track, what you've got is kind of 40 lots of subtle reverb, and then all of that added up starts to sound crazy, and you get this big sea of undecipherable reverb. So you've got to kind of really, really factor that in when you're kind of mixing tracks that are kind of soloed. So you're just mixing a certain part at a time. You got to think about how that's going to fit in with the rest of the mix. Because it's definitely, you can fall into the trap of just kind of going one by one through each track, soloing it, making it sound as good as possible. But then when you put it all together, it's just this big sea of chaos, and it doesn't really sound that good. So yeah, that's pretty much my advice for mixing reverb. Yeah, if you have any kind of comments or whatever, post them up. Or if you have any more tips for everyone else watching, post them up as well. But yeah, that's reverb for you. And yeah, in terms of, I'm sure I get a few people asking what reverb to use, kind of what plugins. It really depends. I mean, a lot of the Ableton reverbs are quite good for just general purpose kind of spaces. So don't kind of overlook the presets. I've spoken to quite a few people about the reverb in Ableton, and a lot of people don't realize there even are these presets. All they do is choose the standard reverb and then just kind of tweak it themselves. But yeah, really have a dig through the presets. They are pretty good. However, when it comes to like convolution reverb and stuff, Ableton doesn't really have much of that stuff, and it's not as great for the really kind of creative or kind of a bit surreal kind of small room reverb stuff. So sometimes it's cooler to use plugins. I know personally I'm a big fan of the convolution reverbs in Isotope Trash 2. However, yeah, there's loads of cool shit. Best thing to do is just give it a go, and don't be afraid to use presets with reverb, or don't be afraid of making your own. So yeah, just have an experiment with them. That's the best thing to do. And you'll find reasonably quickly you'll get a feel for kind of what a few various presets sound like. And then when you're feeling creative, you'll know, broadly speaking, which presets to jump at if you just want a certain style of reverb, which is cool shit. Anyway, yeah, been Multiplier. Boom, 8 minutes, 18, 19, 20, 21 seconds, done. Right, stop record.